Welcome to part 2 of the two-part series entitled His Excellency George Washington, Father of His Country. Across the United States of America, 740 schools, a dozen colleges and universities, 26 mountains, 155 towns and counties, various bridges, parks, and forts, the $1 bill, the 25-cent coin, and the nation's very first postage stamps all commemorate His Excellency George Washington. In addition, a colossal sculpture at Mount Rushmore, an entire state, and the national capital stand proudly as memorials to the man who served as America's first president. On October 19, 1781, under Commander-in-Chief George Washington's astute leadership, the Continental Army experienced a momentous victory ending years of conflict. Peace negotiations began, and the United States was recognized as a free and independent nation on September 3, 1783, after the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Stories abound of His Excellency George Washington's compassionate and gallant leadership. During a battle in Germantown, a suburb of Philadelphia, on October 4, 1777, his men found a terrier belonging to General Howe, leader of the opposing British Army, and suggested keeping the dog as a trophy to demoralize him. George Washington decided against the idea and took good care of the dog as if it were his own. To the surprise of all, he then declared a ceasefire to send back the dog under a flag of truce with a note written by his aide, Alexander Hamilton. The note read, "General Washington's compliments to General Howe. He does himself the pleasure to return to him a dog, which accidentally fell into his hands, and by the inscription on the collar appears to belong to General Howe." Earlier this year, the Robb collection revealed newly discovered letters written in 1783 by George Washington, ordering the release of the last and most consequential soldiers held in custody. These original documents remind us of the vision, mercy, and moral strength of George Washington's leadership. Indeed, George Washington was a man of peace and had accepted his role only to serve his nation during its critical time. On December 23, 1783, he resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and returned to his beloved civilian life at Mount Vernon. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention to decide how the American nation would be governed began in Philadelphia, and George Washington was elected to preside over it. At the beginning of the proceedings, he stated,
"Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God." A document was finally drawn up and presented. After 4 months of intense debate, the current Constitution of the United States was finally ratified by the original 13 states: New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The states now had to decide who would be their new nation's first president, and George Washington was chosen unanimously, winning all 69 electoral votes. The American people knew that His Excellency George Washington did not seek power and honors, but rather sought personal integrity. He was morally opposed to excessive drinking, smoking tobacco, gambling, and profanity. He publicly encouraged people to pray. He was therefore the only man that the Americans would entrust with this new form of centralized power. His Excellency George Washington once again gave up his peaceful life in the countryside and traveled to the nation's capital, New York, to accept a new calling to serve his nation. On April 30th, 1789, the New York State Chancellor administered the very first presidential oath. George Washington was presented with the Bible, which he opened to Genesis 49. He placed his left hand on the open Bible, raised his right hand, and took the following oath.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
He then bent over and kissed the Bible in an act of reverence to the Almighty, who had faithfully guided and saved him countless times before. He proceeded to the Senate chamber to deliver the first ever inaugural address, which he opened by confirming his sense of duty.
Fellow citizens of the Senate and the House of Representatives, among the vicissitudes incident to life, no event could have filled me with greater anxieties than that of which the notification was transmitted by your order. I was summoned by my country, whose voice I can never hear but with veneration and love, from a retreat which I had chosen with the fondest predilection.
In a form of prayer, he stated,
It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that His benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States, a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes.
He then continued,
No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained.
Both swearing the oath on the Bible and giving an inaugural address were ceremonial actions invented by His Excellency George Washington that have largely been followed since 1789. Immediately after his inaugural address, President Washington and the entire Congress proceeded to St. Paul's Chapel to hear a service performed by the Chaplain of Congress. On October 3, 1789, recognizing the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, President Washington declared November 26th as a day of public thanksgiving. This later inspired His Excellency Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation. His Excellency George Washington went on to establish several precedents. He set up the first U.S. cabinet. Perhaps the most important legislation passed during his presidency was the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed civil rights and liberties like freedom of speech, press, and religion. In the 1792 United States presidential election, His Excellency George Washington was again unanimously elected for a second term. He later declined to run for a third term, thus setting a precedent of a two-term limit to the presidency, which was passed as a constitutional amendment in 1947. To this day, he remains the only U.S. president to have been elected unanimously. On September 19, 1796, he delivered a farewell address, which is still considered to be one of the most important documents in American history. His recommendations include encouraging the American people to remain unified and loyal to the nation and to avoid the influence of foreign powers. He also states,
"Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports."
In March 1797, His Excellency George Washington retired to his beloved Mount Vernon, where he passed away 2 years later. As one of the founding fathers of the United States, His Excellency George Washington is often referred to as the father of his country, in recognition of his capital role in the formation of the nation. The National Day of Prayer is observed every year on the first Thursday in May and holds special meaning for the American people. It is a day of remembrance of God and of the founding fathers of the United States who sought divine wisdom. People of all faiths gather together and pray for God's guiding hand to once again lead the nation's way forward. His Excellency George Washington's integrity, self-discipline, courage, and respect for others inspired admiration and trust in the people and made him a popular and cherished president. Dr. James Thatcher wrote, "It was not difficult to distinguish him from the others. His personal appearance is truly noble and majestic." General Henry Knox stated, "General Washington fills his place with vast ease and dignity and dispenses happiness around him." In a recent conference with Supreme Master Ching Hai, Master graciously revealed her fascinating relationship with His Excellency George Washington.
We were wondering if Master has ever been a U.S. president in the past, or even one of the founding fathers?
Why you keep asking this kind of question? I cannot even prove it. Yeah, I know. President Washington?
Yes, Master. Yes,
you remember him?
Yes, Master.
Yeah. I was your master.
Oh.
Surprised you, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I can talk politics these few days. I know the inside and the outside. See what I'm saying? I know the opposition and the self.
With deep awe and admiration, we are grateful for the noble legacy of His Excellency George Washington, who founded America on God's laws.
Upon screening this show, Supreme Master Ching Hai conveyed the following comments to the Supreme Master television team.
God love, folks. Thank you all. Good host, lovely voice, very nostalgically Southern, nice to hear. For some reasons, this show brought M tears. M watched it again and again.
Thank you, graceful viewers, for your company today on our program.